My name is Hintsa. I'm joined by Suzy, Madge, one of our leadership mentors and most experienced coaches, and a positive psychologist. I can't tell you how excited I am about this session. It was really born out of, I'd say, personal need, to be honest. We've all been going through quite a bit of turmoil in the last couple of years, and now reading the news about Russia and the invasion of Ukraine, I remember I went through this like bolt of emotions, like a really mixed up, messed up feeling, from fear to anger to just helplessness, like a very, very horrible, deep feeling of helplessness. Like, what can I do? And then realizing there really isn't that much that we can do. And with that, I reached out to Suzy saying, hey, there's, what can I do for myself? What can I do as a leader for my organization? First of all, what is it that we're all going through? And in this session, what we wanted to do was dive a little bit deeper into those themes. What is it that we're experiencing as individuals, psychologically, physically, after years of crisis, going into another one, a different one. What's happening? What's going on? What should I be aware of as a leader? What are the things that I can do for myself individually? And what are the things that I can do for my organization? Before we dive deeper into that, though, I promised Nora that I would give you a few housekeeping rules. So as you can see, this session is being recorded. We'll share the recording in our website next week. So if any of you need to leave at any point, you can watch the whole thing later. If you want to enjoy myself and Suzy, I promise we'll also talk about something else and then how to prepare for a webinar while isolating from COVID with a 6-month-old and your mother in the next room. We will also answer questions from the audience. So if you have anything that you would like to contribute, share, comment, ask, please put them down in the chat. We'll collect them and we'll answer them at the end of the session. I think, Nora, you can also pop anything at us even during the session if there's something that really feels pertinent to that topic. With that, I think we're ready to go. Maybe one more thing. As we're going through this session and talking about these themes, I just do want to mention that nothing that myself or we are going through can compare to what the people of Ukraine are going through right now. And I just want to kind of highlight that already in the beginning of the session. This is by no means comparable. At the same time, I do want to be honest about it, about what I'm feeling, because I don't think I'm alone. I don't think I'm alone with these feelings. I don't think I'm alone with these feelings as a leader. I think this is something that we're all experiencing, certainly in Finland, where we share 1,300 kilometers of border with Russia. This is something that has been definitely top of mind. But yeah, with that, this is nothing compared to the individuals, to the people actually affected by the war. Our heart goes out to them, and I think I speak for myself and for all of my colleagues in Hintsa Performance. We're actively seeking ways to also help. But with that, maybe let's now dive into the topic. So, Suzy, I am actually very, very excited to ask you these questions. We had a brief chat beforehand, and I've been kind of thinking about all these things that I want to talk to you about ever since. But let's start with the basics. I mean, we've talked about, grief. We've talked about the stages of grief. We've talked about stress and anxiety already for 2 years with COVID. But what's going on right now that we are entering from one crisis to another one, like chronic stress? What's going on psychologically, physically? What's happening to us?
Yeah. Okay. So let's just get down to the basics, therefore, of stress responses. Let's look at stress responses and see how they can inform us what's happening psychologically, and then also what's happening to us hormonally, and then what effect that has on us, again, in terms of how we are as parents, as leaders, as team members. Okay, so first of all, anyone who's watching this will probably have heard of one of the 3 stress responses that we have. Okay, most people will have heard of fight, flight, freeze stress response, but there are actually 2 others. So let's have a quick look at those 3 first of all, okay, and see if they can help us to inform ourselves how to behave as members of family and also as members of a working organization. So the fight, flight, freeze stress response, that's the one most of us have heard of, and that is our default stress response. So that means that if we don't deliberately seek to use the other 2 that I'm going to come on to in a minute, we are going to go into this fight, flight, flee stress response. And that has been an amazing stress response to keep us alive as humans for thousands of years, because when the saber-toothed tiger was in front of us, okay, we go straight into this fight, flight, freeze stress response. We get this whoosh of this hormone called cortisol that many of you will have heard of. And the job of cortisol is to give us energy in order to stand and fight the saber-toothed tiger, or turn around and run away very, very quickly, the flight part, or freeze and pretend we're not there. Okay, so we don't meet that many saber-toothed tigers at the moment, although many of us, particularly people who live in Ukraine, will be experiencing a lot of fight, flight, freeze stress response for good reason. Okay, and that's one of the big changes at the moment, is that we couldn't really fight or run away or freeze from COVID. It was a stress response that we had, but not necessarily sort of in terms of evolution, a particularly appropriate one. But for people in Ukraine, the fight, flight, freeze stress response is actually the appropriate stress response. Okay, but for those of us who are not in Ukraine or in, say, in Poland or in Hungary, we're getting this whoosh of cortisol. So we get this whoosh of energy, but then what do we do then? Well, what we feel like doing is shouting and screaming and being angry, because we've got this energy, but we've got nothing really to do to get rid of it. That's why when a printer doesn't work, when we're trying to print something, what we want to do is pick up the printer and slam it out the window. Okay, or a really annoying work colleague, we just want to go bush because we've got all of this energy. Okay, so that's the first thing to know, is that we've got this cortisol. It's there to give us energy. We know it is the stress hormone, but one word of warning about energy is it's very, very narrowing, because we're focusing on the saber-toothed tiger, on the threat, on the attacker or the aggressor. So what that means for us in a work setting is that we can go very, very, very narrow focused. Now that can be great if we need to solve a complex problem, okay. But equally, if we need to remain open to other people's suggestions or to other possibilities, then that cortisol really hinders that. And so quite often when I'm feeling kind of rather stressed, because I know about the effect of cortisol, I'll ask myself, is this actually me, or is this the cortisol talking, or is this the cortisol behaving? Have you got any examples that you can give us about how you know that the cortisol is sort of taking over what could be a sage response for you, Stina? Give us an idea.
Oh, that's great. You're playing it right back at me. Well, I think I've actually shared this within the organization, just as a pre-warning to my colleagues. My cortisol talking is when I get very snappy.
Yeah.
I'll have a very snappy, snarky, unconstructive answer and feedback to probably any suggestion that you have. That's my cortisol talking, and I know that there would be there would probably be a much more constructive way of going about those things, but it's a snappy, not the best part of me that comes through then.
So that's a really, really great example that as a leader, if we see that someone is in negative stress, is in distress, and they're probably behaving quite cortisol-like, and we say, you know, can I help? That you might well get that, no, I'm fine, or of course you can't help, no one can help. So in fact, maybe another way to phrase that question would be, what can I do to help? So instead of can I help, what can I do to help? Because what that does is it encourages the person who's in the negative stress to get into the second stress response. Remember I said there were 3. We've looked at fight, flight, freeze. This cortisol gives us energy to run away from the saber-toothed tiger. But there's a second stress response, which is called the challenge stress response. And instead of fighting or running away from the stressor. What the challenge stress response encourages us to do is to approach the stressor, so go towards it and see where we can create control around the threat, the negative stressor. Okay, so by asking that question, what can I do to help? What you're doing is that you're encouraging the staff member to think, okay, so A, you're sort of already priming them with the idea that something can be done, as opposed to it's hopeless and helpless. So something can be done. And what can I do? Just by asking that question, you're actually bringing in the third stress response, which is the depend and befriend stress response, which is basically where you confer or you ask for help. So just by using one smarter question, what can I do to help? You're encouraging the person who's undergoing the stress to think something can be done. I can create some kind of control over the situation, but also you're going to the third stress response, which is you are not alone. I am with you and we can look at this together. Okay, so those are the three stress responses. And that's one of the things that you really want to look out for, is this narrowing, this black and white, this going very, very binary, very snappy, as you were saying, Stina, around cortisol and as a leader, and then kind of going in and just, you can say to yourself, okay, I think that's the cortisol talking, that's not really them talking. So how can I get them into one of those other two stress responses, challenge or tend and befriend, and both? So that's a little bit of basics around stress response and cortisol. Was there anything else you wanted to know about some of the sort of basics, maybe something like the Kubler-Ross grief model or learned helplessness? What interests you around there?
Absolutely, those two. Maybe first, going back still to the example that you just shared, we can notice these signs in others, and I know we, for instance, have done in our even in our management team, we've actually shared early signals of stress with each other, so that we can help kind of help each other also become more aware of when it is the cortisol talking.
Yeah.
But what is it if I notice in myself that okay, I am getting snappy, which is my cortisol talking? What can I do as an individual?
That's a really great question, and there's actually a really, really, really straightforward answer to that. And it's something that we can all do, because it's something we do 20,000 times a day, and that is breathe. Okay, so breathing, there's quite a lot in the media about breath at the moment, and there's lots and lots of different arguments about should you breathe through your nose or your mouth, or should you do square breathing. The simplest response to this question is out breath longer than in breath. Okay, that's it. So you breathe in for 3. So let's do it together a few times. So you're going to breathe in for 3 and you're going to breathe out for 6. So your out breath is going to be longer than your in breath. Simplest instruction. Let's just do it 3 or 4 times. Okay, and then sort of note afterwards how your state is and how you feel. So in for 3, out for 6. In for 3, out for 6. In for 3, out for 6. One more. In for 3, out for 6. Okay, what, if anything, has that done for you, Stina?
I feel better already. That's such a cliche. I was a tiny bit stressed before this webinar.
Yeah.
So, that is incredible though. So what's going on? What happens?
Okay, so what we're doing is we're playing with something called our autonomic nervous system. So there's 2 branches of the autonomic nervous system. There's the sympathetic, which is the one that gives us energy. Cortisol helps us to get the energy, get the excitement, get the arousal up. Okay, so that's the upper. And then there's the other side of the autonomic nervous system, which is called the parasympathetic, which is the down regulator. That's the relaxer. And anytime you're doing out breath longer than in breath, you are down regulating. You're bringing everything down to calm. So that kind of breathing, it's amazing to really calm down little kids when they're getting a tantrum. You're going to be needing that in about a year and a half, Stina. most of us at Hintsa use this type of breathing before we go to sleep when we're lying in bed, just to really kind of down regulate, to deliberately bring that cortisol, which can really, really hang around. And actually that cortisol I was talking about before, if it hangs around our body long term, that's really not great in terms of well, particularly health implications, actually, because when we're very, very cortisol-y, one of the things that we're doing is we're really impacting the efficacy of our immune system. So bring everything down, reduce the cortisol, relax, just out breath longer than in breath.
I love the simplicity of that. Hey, now I want to pick up on something that you just mentioned again. You said, when the cortisol hangs around for a long time, and obviously, I think what's different right now, what feels different to me, is that this almost feels like not yet again, because it feels sort of like we've been going through this fluctuation of like, oh, a new variant, what's it going to do? Restrictions, no restrictions, more restrictions. Really worried about our loved ones. At least for me, that's been a huge theme over the past 2 years. And then sort of right when we were thinking that we're kind of getting out of the woods, it's like another. It feels really tiring. So what's different? And if this is the stress response, what happens when it lingers around for a long time?
Oh, it's a really, really great question. So in order to kind of answer that, just on a brief note of the cortisol, just to finish off with the cortisol thing, if our cortisol hasn't been used up by the end of the day, cortisol just basically interferes with melatonin production, and melatonin is our sleep hormone. And it means that if we're very cortisol-y, it's that feeling, you will have it every day at the moment and every evening, Stina, as a new mother, that wired and tired, where physically you're tired, but your brain is buzzing. And that's the cortisol. Okay, so that's why that out breath longer than in breath is really, really useful. Another thing to do as you're preparing to go to bed would be some slow stretching or yoga, or a slow walk, just to really do everything as deliberately as you can to just really, really wind down. The other thing to do is just read a fiction book. So anything where you're just really winding down. But in more direct answer to your question, this helplessness, you mentioned the word helpless in your introduction, and there's actually a whole psychological theory which was created in around the 1970s around learned helplessness. So briefly, what the psychologist Marty Seligman did was he had dogs, and he had 2 sets of dogs, okay, and he wanted to see what their ability would be to control electric shocks, to learn to control essentially a negative stressor, okay, which was an electric shock. Now then, one set of dogs, he just straight away put them into the position where they could straight away learn to control the electric shocks, and they learned to control them really, really quickly. But then there was another set of dogs who, before allowing them to learn to control, what he did was he administered random electric shocks that they could not control. Okay, so they learned helplessness. And then after they'd been subjected to that, when they were put given the opportunity to then learn to control the electric shocks, none of them could learn it. So they'd been rendered helpless by the total and utter lack of control around what happened to them. Okay, so yeah, that was dogs, not humans. Nevertheless, I'm sure we can all think of people who've had very little or no control over what has happened to them, like most of us with the COVID sanctions and the change all the time, and the negative change, constant negative change. And then another thing coming on, all of us have a little bit learnt to be helpless. And then once you've learned helplessness, it's actually really quite tricky to learn optimism or learn helpfulness, but we can actually do it. We can actually do it, because after Seligman had done his theory around learned helplessness, he then went on to develop another theory around learned optimism, which is a little bit similar to the sort of attitudinal or thinking change which is used in the psychological intervention called cognitive behavioral therapy. So remember the cortisol and the narrowing. What we really could do with doing in this situation is just to remember to remain as open as possible, because it's through remaining open that we can see hope and possibility. So in terms of a leader as well, I think one of the jobs as leaders or team members is to really encourage staff to continue to see possibility, to remain open, to see possibility, and almost sort of like a perspective check kind of thing. What do you think about that? What have you got any ideas as a CEO of a big company how that could be put into practice?
I love that idea of a perspective check. And I think, you started building on something wonderful, which is sort of like, hey, what is it that we can do as a leader in this situation, or as a team in this situation? And I think I actually, what you talk about, like the narrowing perspective, that really resonates with me, because I think for all of us, the initial reaction, obviously, to the crisis in the beginning was like, let's focus on the execution, let's turn this thing around, let's get into it. Then that's been kind of going on and on for quite a long time right now. And we're sort of in a danger zone of that continuing and narrowing down even further in my mind. And I think, what we have done, and this is now speaking maybe, excuse me, what we have done in our management team is actually that we've had, we've introduced a new meeting type called discussion, which is really about, it doesn't have an objective. Everything that during COVID and all these remote meetings for us you have a set agenda. You're either, it's either informational, you're deciding on something. It's very executional. And what we try to introduce is a new type of meeting where we don't have an agenda. We have a theme that we want to discuss. And that is sort of, that is, I guess, we never called it a perspective check, but it is sort of around that. So we have a theme that we've picked up on, and we talk about it. Quite often it does lead to some kind of next step or action, but that's by no means on the objective of the meeting. There is none. It really is more about like, hey, what's going on? What can we, what are the things that we can do? And I think as a leader, another one that, in addition to these, has been sort of your point about encouragement and trying to encourage individuals to see the opportunities. I think there's also something around clarity and goal setting. I don't know if another one that could maybe link to this.
Yeah, so I mean, it does actually, because there's some kind of recent thought around goal setting and how it relates into this. This doesn't sound like they're a particular natural fit, but I will explain, around positive emotion. So there's been lots and lots of work by positive psychologists, which is what I am. I'm a positive psychologist, over the last 2 years, of how to retain that element of being fully human. We've been tunneled, we've been binary, we've been cortisol-y, we've really lost perspective and possibility, and we've just gone very, very, very narrow. But to be fully human is to embrace all parts of emotion. The tricky thing about being human is that we have a negativity bias. We're wired to spot threat and remember it. Great, that's kept us alive for thousands of years. We learned to know where the saber-toothed tiger's lair was going to be, and which were the poisonous red berries, and what bush that was. That's been great. So what we have to do as humans is we have to be very deliberate about positive emotion. And the funny thing is, which we've realized about goal setting, actually not relatively recently, and the hormone, which is called dopamine. Now, many of you will have heard of dopamine in terms of the pleasure hormone. Actually, much more specifically, dopamine is the anticipation of pleasure hormone. So we know from gambling experiments that gamblers get the dopamine little pleasure hit once they've set the bet and in the anticipation of the result. That's when the dopamine comes, is the anticipation. So if you follow that to its natural conclusion, actually goal setting, not like a far off distant outcome goal, but regular small bite-sized journey goals, can keep the momentum, keep the little hits and doses of dopamine up. And dopamine it does make us feel good. It does make us feel good. So goal setting is really important. And the other thing about goal setting, which I might try to come onto a little bit later, and this is really where leaders and staff can work together, is goal setting is one of the 4 fundamentals of getting into flow state, which, as you probably know, Stina, is one of my favorite topics in the whole world. I could spend a whole week talking about flow state. which is a theory created by Csikszentmihalyi. Hopefully we'll have the opportunity to come back to it later. But setting goals which are kind of mutually agreed is very, very important in terms of not only employee engagement, but actually being able to challenge oneself. So goal setting is hugely important. So that's a really, really great point. So for dopamine and for flow state.
That sounds like, you know, I have to say, this sounds like stuff that we have been doing in the past 2 years. It doesn't sound fundamentally different to, the reactions that we have been doing. So basically, I like your point also about bringing your whole human, addressing the whole human, because I think that's another thing that we've learned through the pandemic is, we do have, and it's become very, very clear now that we're working from home or isolating with our families and trying to work at the same time. It's become very natural to also kind of maybe bring a little bit more of who you are to work than it has been before. I want to segue from that to another topic that we talked about briefly before, which is the concept of identity. And in Hintsa we talk a lot about the core as the foundational piece of well-being or better life. And when we talk about the core, we talk about your sense of identity. Do you know who you are? Your sense of purpose. Do you know what you want in life, and your sense of control, which we actually touched on a little bit already. What's the role, or how does the core relate to all this?
Yeah, so it's a really great question. As you just said, we've already covered a little bit about control, loss of control, learned helplessness, and also in that challenge stress response, how to approach the negative stressor and see where control can be created. I'm not talking about controlling the whole negative stressor. It might just be one slice of it, possibly along with someone else with a tender befriend stress response. But in terms of just to finish up on control, there's a really, really, really great phrase by the very famous psychologist and medical doctor Viktor Frankl. If anyone is reading this and you haven't read the book Man's Search for Meaning, just order it now. In fact, press pause on this recording, order it, or go to the bookshop and get it, and then come back and listen, because it's an amazing book. How many times have you read it, Stina?
I think about 3. And I read it at, when I first started reading it, I read it at one go. Yeah, it's great.
It's not a long book. You can just sit down and you'll just read it in an afternoon. Anyway, Viktor Frankl, who was an inmate in various concentration camps, including Auschwitz, he says when every other freedom is taken away from you, there is one remaining freedom, and that freedom is the freedom to choose your attitude. So you can always control your attitude to what's happening. If you can't control the actual thing, you can control your attitude towards it, which if any of you know your ancient Greeks and Romans, your classics will know that that's a very, very stoic attitude, this notion of choosing your attitude or controlling your attitude. So that book is called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, Frankl. Okay, so that's a little bit more about control, but let's get on to identity, because that's quite a nice juicy topic, and it's one of the ones when I'm mentoring people I quite often go in on my first or second session. And at Hintsa we really think about identity not as a single one identity, but we all have many identities. And the thing about our identities, the slightly confusing thing about our identities, is that we have lots, and actually they can really, really clash. Can you think of any of your identities which actually clash, which actually, Stina, think of your identities. What 2 things of your identities that are actually slightly in competition with each other?
Oh my goodness. You know what, Suzy? I've been going through like a minor identity crisis in the last 6 months. As you mentioned, I'm a new mother, and that really has been a huge huge change. Everyone told me it would be a massive change, and I was like, yeah, and it totally has been a huge change. Go
That's
ahead.
that identity of superhuman. Oh yes. Yes, I know. Everyone says it. Yes, and lo.
Everyone says it will change. I'm fully prepared. Don't you worry. I've thought about it all already. No, I hadn't. Absolutely not. I think obviously, if I think about my identities, that would be a natural one. When I think about my identity as a new mother, and that whole kind of like, I've always had a very strong, one of my identities has always been very strongly related to family and responsibility. Say, and I was a mother, but previously as eldest of 6 siblings, et cetera, et cetera. So that's been always like a huge part. And then there's another one of which is very much driven by business. I'm an entrepreneur in second generation, and there's a natural clash. But there's a third one which also clashes, and right now that's the one that's being sort of underserved, tremendously underserved, because of the other two taking up about 150% of my time. It's and that's sort of the one that I cherish, and that gives me a lot of energy, which is my sort of like adventurous side. I discovered that through my burnout years ago. I love running. I don't do marathons. I do races in deserts and woods and mountains, and that's sort of a huge part of me, sort of like a curious adventure type. And that has been very much in the background for the last what is it now? Almost a year.
Yes, indeed. So you've got these three, we know about these three identities then. So the adventurer, family, and CEO, entrepreneur. Okay. I've got a really weird question for you, just to see if we can tease out any other identities. Okay. Think of all the shoes in your shoe closet. Okay. And what all of those shoes represent. And are there any shoes which don't fall into those three categories, those three elements, like pillars of your identities? And what identity do they show for you?
Wow. Okay. So I have way too many shoes to start with, probably. So that's the beginning of it. Most of them fall quite neatly into those categories, I'd say. Okay. Apart from, I have a pair of riding boots and my ballet shoes, which haven't gotten, or my pointos, which haven't gotten any use in a long time.
Wow. Okay. So it's not exactly adventure, but it's sort of it's activity, isn't it? It's very particular activity. So were you to get out your riding boots or your ballet shoes and use them, what would that do for you, and how could that be done?
That's an interesting question. Oh, so this is becoming a coaching session, I see. I think the ballet one is actually maybe a little bit more different or interesting. That for me is a creative piece or a creative part. I used to dance ballet, as obvious by the shoes, and I used to play the violin very actively. Neither one of which I actually have done it for a very long time. So that's an interesting point. They used to be the thing that helped me ground myself in a way, and maybe kind of explore a different side that doesn't really have an objective, that's not very driven, that's more sort of that's not very, even in adventure, I do adventure racing, so it's kind of like there's still sort of that driven aspect. In ballet or playing the violin, it's more about honing the skill and getting really lost in the music, and that sort of a completely different creative side that actually, now that I talk about it out loud in a webinar with I don't know how many hundred participants, I haven't thought about that in a long time.
Okay. So what you're describing, of course, is flow state. I'm sure you realize that. That is you will get into flow state in work, and you'll get into flow state when you're adventure racing, when the suffering isn't too high. But actually the violin, the ballet, probably the riding as well, actually, that could be one of your avenues, one of your domains for flow state, which has been very, very underused. Which probably brings us quite neatly onto flow state. I mean, I could coach you some more around that, but you get the gist, okay? It's this, what we're coming back to is, in this time of difficulty and challenge and crisis, you can see now that there's been this narrowing. So essentially, in terms of your identities, you've got these three very strong identities, two of which you're serving, one of which you're not. You're serving the business, you're serving the family, you're not really serving the adventure, and you spotted that immediately. But actually, if we really look in, then there's this other ballet, riding, violin, which you haven't served for so long you'd actually forgotten about it before we asked about the shoes. So again, it's this notion of opening and broadening and possibility in order to get you into the flow state. So I think, shall I explain a bit about flow state now? Because this seems like the kind of perfect time. Yeah, okay. So Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who's the creator of flow theory, grew up as a little boy, and this is very relevant for us at the moment, particularly anyone who is experiencing a lot of difficulty in Ukraine, or any of the countries bordering Ukraine, anyone who knows anyone who's really mixed up in that unbelievably difficult situation. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi grew up in an internment camp during the Second World War. And he realized that most people could not cope psychologically or mentally with the difficulty of the internment camp. However, there was one group of people who could, and that group of people all did the same thing, and that was play chess. Okay, so the chess players were doing something that nobody else was, and it was the chess players who were able to psychologically survive the deprivation of the internment camp. And then when Mihai Csikszentmihalyi grew up, he became a psychologist, and he decided to study this state, this notion of the chess players. So he did his initial thing was he did a big study, loads of interviews. So it was qualitative research on chess players, rock climbers, I think there was a type of musician, and also brain surgeons, neurosurgeons. And he essentially created this notion of flow state, which there are many kind of descriptions of. So one of the ones that Csikszentmihalyi uses is that it's adult play, coming back to the chess players, but also flow state is the state that all performers, so athletes, musicians, dancers, creatives, business people want to be in when they want to be at their best. So it is a state of ultimate or optimal performance, and also it is a state of optimal experience. And also, as we know from that chess player story, it is a state to get you through. It gets you through difficulty. If you can deliberately create flow state as regularly and habitually as possible when things are difficult, that is also a way to get you through difficulty.
Can we get more concrete on that? So you said like deliberately create flow state. So what would that mean for, okay, as an individual, I can maybe think of like, okay, I have these areas that I have left sort of unexplored for a little, or underutilized for a little while. What can we do as leaders in terms of our organization? How can we kind of create that for our organizations or teams?
That's a really great question. So there are 4 elements that you have to get into flow state, okay? And this is a state which is both an individual and a team or a group state. So for example, we're talking about ballet and we're talking about music. So musicians in an orchestra, or ballet dancers in a chord ballet will probably be in flow state altogether, okay? It's trickier to get into flow state as a team than it is an individual. But anyway, you need 4 elements, and that is, you need a comparable or an equal amount of challenge and skill. So you've got to be doing something you're good at, and the challenge has to be high, okay? 1 and 2. Number 3, as we said a few minutes ago, there's got to be clearly set goals that you're interested in and that you have contributed to creating. So you've got to be interested in the goal. And also there has to be, and this is the other thing for leaders, is there's got to be immediate relevant feedback. So as a leader, to try and create flow state in your individual staff and also in a team situation, then high challenge, high skill, clearly set goals, and immediate feedback. But I've got a question for you. Can you think of a time when you experienced individual flow and when you've experienced group or team flow?
You know, when you were describing the orchestra, I immediately went back to it. That's definitely a place where I've experienced team flow in a very sort of, and I would even say it was a stronger experience for me personally than getting into in the same medium. And then getting into a flow playing by myself, I found the kind of shared experience to be even stronger. And I'm wondering, I'm kind of going off a tangent here. Please excuse me. I'm wondering if to what extent does the fact that we have been sort of isolated for such a long time now and deprived of the connections, the natural connections we had with our colleagues and with our families, even with our friends. To what extent has that impacted the fact that maybe we haven't been able to get into flow?
Yeah, it's a really, really great question. Because of course, I mentioned previously that as humans, we have this default negative bias. That's what's kept us alive. But also we are pro-social. Humans are pro-social. We're meant to be with other people. Okay. If you believe certain human biologists or anthropologists, probably about 150 people that they think is connected to the size of the brain. Anyway, that's a different webinar. We are meant to be with people, and also, of course, we've been very, very, very isolated. But you can see how we've got this theme of everything just going narrow. Number of people you're in contact with, what you're concentrating in on. It's just this real sort of narrowing. So, and of course, we've developed this habit now of spending more time alone, not going to the office as much, and habits. You can change habits. It takes around about 60 days to automate a new habit. It's easier to replace habits than to just bluntly remove them. It's much easier to replace than to remove, or indeed to create a new habit. But it has a massive effect on us. Just the kind of two things I'm going to mention in particular. One is human touch. So for people who lived on their own, so for my clients who were living on their own, as soon as they possibly could, the first thing I really, really, really sort of coach them or encourage them into doing is just go get a massage. We need human touch to release oxytocin, which is that friendship love hormone, which, by the way, some people think is possibly emitted during that tend and befriend stress response as well. But so touch, we've missed a lot of human touch, a lot of us. Okay. And then the second thing is laughter. We just don't have as much laughter or fun. And laughter is a really, really, really great de-stressor. So brings stress down, and we just haven't had that. In fact, we know that laughter in a group, so social laughter, is helps to emit a really surprising positive emotion hormone that we don't associate with laughter at all. That's actually endorphins. So for you, what do you associate endorphins with?
Exercise.
Yeah, right. But actually endorphins are released when we're laughing with other people, social laughter. So when I do my identity exercise once a year, because our identities do change, just like our strengths. They're sort of they're anchored, but they're not fixed, and they can change. When I do my identities every year, I realized that I was really neglecting the fun and laughter. And so one of the deals I made with myself was that I was going to get myself to comedy clubs as much as possible. So and then you sort of have to go to kind of, okay, so which comedians do you like? But it's really about this very, very deliberate knowing who you are, deliberate being as fully human as possible, and right now being deliberately as open as you possibly can. So that's your surprising fact for the day about endorphins and social laughter.
Yeah, I didn't associate that, but when I think about it, isn't like one of the things that Navy SEALs as well, a highlight is that, humor, when you're faced with a super tough situation, what
Absolutely.
you actually want is humor.
Yeah.
You don't really think about it, but that actually is, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Suzy, I know that we're kind of like, we get 20 minutes and I want to leave some time for questions. I have one kind of final thing, and you mentioned in the beginning already the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief added with that 6th stage of meaning. So just for the ones who maybe don't remember, we've talked about this. I think you probably have been exposed to this model during the last 2 years of, from denial to anger to bargaining to depression and acceptance. And then I think Kessler added meaning as a 6th stage a bit later on to this model. And I have a question for you. What if we can't find meaning in this? What if you feel like, do we always find meaning in this?
No, we don't always find meaning in it, and that's where we come back to hope. Actually, we come back to hope, and I don't mean hope in a sort of a positive thinking, rose-tinted sort of view of the world hope. The thing about hope is hope equals possibility. So we're getting back to this opening, this notion of hope that there could be something else. You know, this is it for now, and yet there could be something else that I can introduce to now or in the future. So we do actually come back to hope. I mean, psychologically, that's what hope is. Hope is an opener. Hope is basically, if you look at the work of Snyder and Lopez, hope is around possibility, and we're back to perspective as well, but it's really about opening to possibility. That's what hope is about. And the thing about hope is, along with our identities, which are very, very individual to us, as I say, they're anchored, not fixed, there's also quite a lot of, there's a big body of work in positive psychology at the moment about strengths. And if any of you want to do a strengths test and you've never done one before, then there are many different organizations which do strengths test. The one we tend to use at Hintsa is the VIA, Values in Action, simply because it's free and online, and it's global, it's cross-cultural. So what they've done in the VIA is an amazing psychologist, Chris Peterson, basically just sent people all over the world finding out what are the common 25 or 26 odd strengths which are completely cross cultures. And what they've done now, since they did that work around about 25 years ago, is they've seen which of these strengths are appropriate for which situations. And we know what the best strengths for resilience, for creating and building resilience are. And those 4 strengths are it's zest, perseverance, and hope. So if you can sort of accommodate hope, an opening and possibility, along with an opening, this notion of sort of keeping going, but somehow keeping the zest, which is where the positive emotion planning comes in, getting in the social laughter for the endorphins, doing some exercise for the endorphins, making sure you're doing some great goal setting for the dopamine. And then the other kind of positive emotion hormone we haven't really mentioned so far would be serotonin. And serotonin is actually quite related to accomplishing things and achievement. So if you can feel like you're accomplishing or achieving, start learning a new language, get back to the violin, Stina, whatever it is, then if we've got these cocktail of positive emotions, which can help us to feel a little more zesty, okay, along with perseverance and hope, then that is how we can create resilience in order to essentially sort of keep going through this very, very difficult period, whilst helping our staff by keeping people as open as possible, goal setting, encouraging flow state. And then we're in this kind of area of, yes, it's difficult, I am here to support you. But there's one other thing I really want to mention for leaders and for people like you and I, Stina, and that is know when you yourself have gone over, you're out of your overdraft, you know. So I've got a question for you, and it's sort of one of my favorite questions to ask when I'm coaching, is when people are really feeling very, very low, is what is your tell? What is your overload tell? Because it can be psychological, and it can also be physical. So for example, my overload tell is my lips go, I get cold sores, I get cracks. And actually recently, since COVID, another of my overload tells is nosebleeds. So what are your overload tells?
Mine actually, well, I have a behavioral one, which is like an early symptom of stress, and that's I start pulling my hair, which is you will have seen it. I do that on occasion. The one where I know that I have gone too far, though, where I know that I'm in overload, is when I can't fall asleep anymore. And I know it's a very, very common one. I talk about it a lot with clients, colleagues, friends. I know that there are a lot of people who suffer with the same. For me, it's, and I guess it links back to what you were saying already earlier, Suzy. You're in that super kind of wired, tired state when you're trying to go to bed. And then at some point you start fearing going to bed. And, you know, a whole another topic of like, one of my favorite, which is the importance of recovery in these times. You know, how can we ensure that we have sufficient mental recovery during the day and sufficient recovery? Like, how do we make sure that we don't compromise the recovery during night, or make the kind of best possible environment or make it the best, give ourselves the best possibility of recovery during the night, even though sometimes it is really, really hard, as it is for me when I'm in overdraft.
Yeah.
Awesome. Nora has some questions from the audience. I'm really looking forward to this. Thank you, Suzy, so far for the discussion. Let's see what we got. Fantastic question. Do you want to take the first one? Is it possible to be prepared for a crisis, and how can I prepare in advance?
Okay, so there are several different elements to answer this. So the first thing that I would go in on is probably adaptability and agility. So creating a habit of being as adaptable as possible. Adaptability and agility and flexibility have actually become really quite a big thing in positive psychology. There's a really, really great book called, it's around neophilia. I'll remember it in a minute. Neophilia is loving the new. So going towards novelty, doing novel things can really, really help us to hone our adaptability skills. So saying yes to novel things as opposed to saying no. Okay, so going towards adaptability and making adaptability a habit, that would be one thing to do. The second thing to do would be to really, really deliberately build resilience. Now, I introduced that word when I was talking about the 3 resilient strengths, which is zest, perseverance, and hope. And then what Stina was talking about the recovery is very, very important for resilience. Okay, so I'm going to just whip through 3 different definitions of resilience in 3 different sort of parts of my work. So first of all, if we're talking philosophically, resilience is suffering transformed. Okay, so it's about having the ability to go through suffering, keep hold of the open hope that things can get better, and then transforming that suffering into something better. That's number 1 philosophically. In terms of hormonally, hormonal resilience is when you have you're emitting less cortisol during the stress response and more of a hormone called DHEA, which is the hormone which is emitted during more emitted during a challenge stress response. That second one I was talking about. And also when you're available and mentally available to see stress as both positive and negative. Okay, stress is actually just neutral physiological arousal. It's just that most of us hear the word stress and we just think straight to negative stress, but actually there is positive stress. Flow state, I was just talking about, is a state of eustress, eustress, positive stress. So it's this proportion, sort of hormonal resilience is proportion of cortisol versus DHEA. And the more DHEA, the more resilient you are. That's the second thing. Then the third thing, coming back to Stina's sort of beseeching us all to recover more, is supercompensation. So when we're training at a gym and we train to failure, we break down the muscle, okay? And then we rest to give the muscle a chance to the fibers to build back thicker, and then the muscle fibers build back thicker and we get stronger. It's the same thing with psychology. We have a very, very, very demanding moment or series of days or weeks or months or years, whatever. Then we recover and then we can build back stronger. But without the recovery, we can't build back stronger. It's as simple as that. And it's very, very important, by the way, after flow moments also to recover, because flow moments, they don't feel particularly demanding, but they are actually very, very, very demanding. And flow, just to kind of recap on that, it's that thing where time speeds up or slows down. You lose the inner critic. There's no little voice in your head anymore criticizing you. You feel like you completely sort of own what you're doing. It's what athletes or musicians would call being in the zone. So flow is a form of positive stress, and it's also demanding. So to prepare for crisis, really, really deliberately make yourself as adaptable and agile as you can, and mentally flexible. And one of the ways to do that is to deliberately approach novelty as much as you can. Number 2, build your resilience as much as you can by deliberate recovery, really, really knowing your stress tells, knowing that when you have an overload tell you have to rest, And then the third thing I would really call in on is back to actually Hintsa's control, which is one of its elements, the core, and that is the kind of Epictetus notion of knowing what you can control and what you can't. And what you can't control, you can still control your attitude to it. So there's three different elements in response to that question.
Thank you, Suzy. Oh, how can I ensure that there is enough positive team time?
Okay. So this is something that I have spoken about with quite a few of the leaders with whom I work, because it's very, very treadmill. The last 2 years have been incredibly treadmill, and people really still feel like they're on that treadmill at the moment. And so being very, very, very deliberate about daily cadence, actually. And so, first of all, knowing who are the staff members or members of the organization who give you a positive zhuzh, okay, give you that, you just love chatting to them. You basically, when you come off a phone or when you walk away from meeting a colleague, who do you feel worse? Who do you come away feeling worse? Who's neutral, and who do you come away feeling better? So think about that, and then think about, at what time of the day do I want my meetings with those people to be? Okay, so depending on okay, so Stina, what are your trickiest times? First of all, tell me, what is your trickiest time of the week? Is there a kind of a time of the week where you regularly just think, oh, it's always this time and I really can't bear it?
Wednesdays, for whatever reason, Wednesdays.
So that's classic, Wednesday afternoon. Okay, so therefore, if you were to think about, you obviously don't name the person, but if you should think about, okay, who would I like to finish my Wednesday working day speaking to? Who is going to live, who can I look forward, who can I savor, look forward to speaking to, and who is going to leave me just with a bit more zest? Can you think of that person?
You, of course. I'm supposed to answer that.
No, I'll pay you later. Fantastic. So therefore, regularly get that meeting in at that time when you want the zhuzh with the person who's going to give you the zhuzh, and then that's that. And then, is there another time of the week when you just think, this is the time of the week when I want to get everybody together, as many people as possible? We might not even talk about work, but it's just, this is the time of the week for this, and we're just gonna, just make sure that it's not a draggy meeting. It's a really, really sort of great session. What time of the week would that be?
That's a really good one. I think we have most of that type of meetings on Thursdays. However, I am recognizing this for ourselves as well. Because of COVID, we have genuinely had less of the kind of, hey, let's get together and do stuff together. And I hope that we can sort of still bring that back, even though or especially as we are faced with another crisis. So I think that's maybe a great reminder for me to kind of make sure that.
Yeah. So that's in answer to that question then. Are there any other questions?
That's a great one. So practical approaches to increasing employee engagement from a psychological perspective.
Yeah, and there's a really, really easy answer to that, and that is flow state. Flow state is the most engaged state that you can be in. There's a lot of very funny research, actually, kind of quite chastening research around flow state at work. And that is, work is actually the ideal arena for flow state, because you're more likely at work than during your leisure time. You're more likely at work to have clearly set goals. You're more likely to have feedback. And you from a lot of people, you're more likely to be using your skill and challenge. But that's probably because people just don't quite get their leisure time right. So if people do get their leisure time right, then obviously they'll have flow state in that. But overall, ever since flow research has looked into work versus leisure, people report experiencing more flow at work than they do at leisure. But the funny thing about the research is that they report experiencing more flow, so engagement, challenge, all that kind of stuff, but they still say that they prefer their leisure time to their work time. Okay, but then if you do a longitudinal piece of research and you introduce staff members to the concept of flow and basically how it's a really, really great state, and it's a very, very, very positive state. The outcomes of flow state it's a massive net positive. Okay, more meaning in life. You feel like you're contributing more. Hormonally, it's very good at upping your dopamine and downing your cortisol. Much more peak experience. There's only really two downsides to flow state. One is that it's very, very addictive. So people who create computer games create them to get people into flow state. So if any of you are very addicted to computer games, or you know people who are, that's why. It's because you're in flow state when you're playing a computer game. And the other downside to flow state is if you're a bit like Stina and I, then it makes you very, 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 it can make you quite risk-seeking, flow state, because a lot of people there's a big association between risk and flow state because the challenge is very, very high when there's risk involved. So that can be quite a negative. But other than that, flow state is a net positive, it's a net good. And so if you just introduce yourself to the concept of flow, then you're basically priming them. And we know as humans, we're super primable. Then the outcomes, people know how, staff and leaders then know what the ingredients are that go into the pot of getting into flow state. We can't force ourselves into flow, but we can set up the right conditions, which is equal challenge and skill, clearly set goals which are interesting to everybody, and immediate, good, helpful feedback. There's other stuff as well. You have to have energy because it's very energetic. Using your strengths massively helps. But yeah, the simple answer to it is flow state for engagement.
Flow state followed by recovery.
Yes, very good, Stina. Flow state followed by recovery. Yeah.
That kind of leads to this question, I think. Can it degrade your leisure time? I feel like I'm often on at work and come home to the people I care about the most, and I'm too tired. That really resonates with me. Yeah,
but basically yes. Basically yes, because as humans, we've probably got 4 excellent hours in us a day. Okay, so by excellent hours, that would be hours of flow state. But, and I'm going to bring in a big but, flow state isn't just, flow state is on a continuum from very, very deep flow, which is the incredibly performant type of flow. So that's what athletes and artists want to be, and to be at their best and to experience life at its best. Very, very deep flow. And then there's micro flow. And micro flow is actually quite good for recovery. So micro flow would be things like doing the crossword, cooking and following a recipe if you're totally absorbed in it, reading a book. Now then, the research always shows us, and if I've asked you this before, then forgive me, but Stina, in terms of occasional deep flow or very frequent micro flow, which do you think is actually more correlated and in fact causal for the 2 classic positive psychology tests, which is satisfaction with life and higher subjective well-being? So are people happier and feel they've got a better life with occasional deep flow or lots of micro flow?
Lots of micro flow.
Correct.
Would be my guess.
Yeah, that's
a wonderful place to stop. So that's sort of like moving from, I think we also talk about passive recovery, like, watching a Netflix show, to active recovery, which is stuff like, instead of watching the Queen's Gambit, the chess show, you actually play chess or do crossword puzzles or do something that gives you a moment of microflow. Suzy, we're at the top of the hour. I love the discussion. Thank you so much for taking the time with me. This was, as said, this webinar, this session was born out of personal need for us to kind of think about practical ways that, we as individuals and we as leaders can cope with yet another crisis, yet another, a moment of uncertainty and of uncertain duration. Thank you, Suzy. Please do reach out if you got any other further questions, and we'll be posting this webinar on our website. Thanks so much.
You can't leave without me asking you one more question, though. I'm a coach. Sorry. What are you going to start doing within the next 24 hours after this conversation?
I'm going to do a breathing exercise, and then I'm going to cuddle with my kid. That's my microflow for the next
Yeah, so cuddles, so brilliant. So cuddles is getting in the oxytocin, it's getting in the touch, it's getting your identity of parenting and family. The breathing is going to help you level out your cortisol, because you'll be constantly wired and tired at the moment. And you remember that as soon as your baby starts talking, getting tantrums, you know to do the breathing with them. So I love doing webinars, but I always want people to actually factor in and think about what are you now what to do to take away from this. So thank you, Stina.
I love it, Suzy. Thank you.